Hello. It is my great pleasure to introduce to the Rising Global Peace Forum Professor Edwina Pio. Professor Pio is based at Auckland University of Technology. She is a Fulbright alumnus and the first and only professor of diversity in New Zealand. With a sense of social justice, her research encompasses the intersections of work, ethnicity, gender, religion, and Indigenous studies. Her research honours the migrant and Indigenous communities with whom she works. She was awarded by the Royal Society the Te Rangi Hiroa Medal for her work on intersectional diversity. Professor Pio is also a trustee to the National Religious Centre of New Zealand. Edwina, welcome. We're so grateful and pleased that you could join us for this year's Rising Global Peace Forum. As you know, the theme for Rising 2020 is the culture of peace. We are very much looking forward to your insights on the topic, and we're certain that we, as well as our participants, will be inspired by your work. We will be highlighting your published research that underpins our conversation, and I really highly recommend you look these articles up because they provide a fascinating lens on the world of diversity management. So without further ado, Edwina, I would like to hand over to you by asking my first question. And I was wondering whether you could just share with us what, in your view, constitutes a culture of peace and what you see as its biggest barriers.
Thank you, Aurelie. It is indeed a privilege to be part of this year's conference, even though I dearly miss not being physically present because of the situation worldwide with reference to COVID. I'd like to do a short introduction in Te Reo, which is the indigenous language of the Maori in the country New Zealand where I live. Kia ora, mai no tātou katoa, ko Edwina Pio tāku enoa. He tangata tiriti aho, no reira tēnā tātou katoa. So thank you very much, and thank you for the first question that you have put to me today on the culture of peace. I think peace is a multi-layered and delicate process. Much of my research focuses on women at work, indigenous people, and pedagogies of hope. You can see that I've written a number of books, and just 5 of them have been put up on the slide that you can see. In the context of a culture of peace, questions revolve around how women can build a culture of peace. And it is in this context that I believe peace and diversity can coexist. I stress the importance of educators, policymakers, not-for-profit, faith-based, and business organizations who can weave the what and how of a culture of peace into their induction programs, professional development, and degree courses. Beyond the absence of conflict and fear of conflict, a culture of peace focuses on restoring dignity and worth. In sewing and mending the tapestry of life through their gender, work, and organization, women are a crucial part of building this informal culture of peace, with some women serving as formal peace builders on negotiating tables of organizations. I'd like to emphasize positive peace, which is defined as the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. The same factors also lead to many other desirable socioeconomic outcomes, as for example, greater income growth, better environmental outcomes, higher levels of well-being, better developmental outcomes, and stronger resilience. And this has been noted by the Institute of Economics and Peace. A culture of peace shapes policies and programs in how work is carried out and how organizations function in societies which may be deeply traumatized by conflict and its aftermath. Examples include jungle brides, AK-47 marriages, women terrorists, and millennial terrorists. Women, as builders of a culture of peace, navigate and restore ruptured relationships in seeking to create and foster a culture of peace. Aspects such as faith, memories, mourning, and healing through women's informal and formal work are significant aspects as women wage peace in business and society. In the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, the country which I now call home, the Institute of Economics and Peace ranks us as number 2 in its global peace rankings of the 2020 Global Peace Index, though of course it is number 1 in the Asia Pacific region, with military expenditure just 1.1% of the GDP of New Zealand. We are number 6 in the Global Gender Gap Index of the World Economic Forum and number 1 in the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, all pointing to the fact that we strongly foster and seek to continue fostering a culture of peace. Undoubtedly, the shootings of Christchurch in New Zealand shocked us to the core here in New Zealand, as it did the world, leading to an outpouring of grief, a change in gun laws, and a focus on, if I use a Maori proverb, he waka eka noa, we are all in this together, or we all sail in the same boat, for they are us, and we are them, as succinctly orchestrated by our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. Positive peace, as developed and analyzed by the Institute for Economics and Peace, is predicated on 8 pillars. And of course, the absence of these would be barriers to a culture of peace. The 8 pillars are a well-functioning government, a sound business environment, acceptance of the rights of others, good relations with neighbors, whether they be in your neighborhood, in your organization, in society, or internationally, a free flow of information so that the press is not muzzled, high levels of human capital, which means the importance of training and development, skills and resources, low levels of corruption, and equitable distribution of resources. So I hope I've answered the question which you raised orally, though one could speak reams on it because it's such an open question that you have raised.
Thank you. In your research, you are an advocate for diversifying culture and knowledge. What do you think we can learn from Indigenous cultures and wisdom about fostering a culture of peace?
It's another interesting question you've posed. And I've just spoken about positive peace being predicated on 8 pillars. And these 8 pillars are in many ways similar to how indigenous peoples through the centuries have sought to live their lives, despite powerful extractive institutional structures which have ensured that indigenous peoples have harvested historical legacies of domination, disruption, and disrespect. In fact, the World Bank notes that indigenous peoples occupy a quarter of the world's surface area, but safeguard 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. But although they make up about 5% of the global population, they account for 15% of the extreme poor. In a recent piece, I was invited to write for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia on gender and indigenous education and practice. I sought to present 7 dichotomous tensions so that the reader and you, the listener for this conference, may be jolted into situating your research or your practice on a binary continuum between these terms. Here, I have sought to implement my own sovereignty in a respectful, dignified, and interwoven manner in conversation and research with indigenous peoples. The seven tensions, which I will briefly mention, are linked to fostering a culture of peace, and they are education systems. Are our education systems inclusive or hegemonic? On the continuum of inclusivity on one side and hegemony on the other side, where do we place our education systems? What is the context of our curriculum? To what extent do we include indigenous wisdom? To what extent do we include Eastern epistemologies and aspects which might be quite different and, of course, in many ways also complementary to the Western rational ways of thinking, which in some ways have become largely the lingua franca, if you will, of how managers operate in the world. The second tension is human rights. To what extent are they upheld or trampled upon? This is a critical aspect when we think of developing cultures of peace. While a country might be a signatory to various human rights, the important thing is how are they implemented? And if they are not implemented, what recourse do individuals have to seeing that there is reconciliation? The third tension is identity. And I would hope that none of us are in a situation where we are miniaturized and considered just one dimensional. So, is our identity validated or is it nullified? And what's the process that it goes through? Do we have dignity and worth for ourselves as well as in the ways other people interact with us? The fourth tension is indigenous knowledge. To what extent do our curricula in universities, to what extent do organizations, whether they be business or not for profit, incorporate and respect indigenous knowledge, or is this under recognized? The fifth aspect is land. And this is a very contentious issue. What is traditional land? Why are indigenous people being evicted from land which belongs to them through the centuries? Because modern man and women have decided that it contains minerals or water or other resources which need to be extracted according to a viewpoint that's considered modern rather than looking at the way in which indigenous people through the centuries have protected and preserved the land and the biodiversity that exists within it. The sixth tension is research. I'm an academic, I'm a passionate practitioner as well. To what extent are we reflexive of what we do? Or are we at the other end of the continuum extractive? How do we work with the participants when we do research? What do we give back to them because of the research we have done? And the seventh aspect or tension I'd like to mention is well being. I think that's particularly important in today's scenario of COVID. Is the well being nurturing? Or at the other end of the continuum, is it violent? And I use the word violent because there is so much of sexual harm, rape, violence, consider Black Lives Matter. And what are we doing to see that systemic injustices are rectified? What are we doing to ensure that is, if I turn systemic injustices on its head, we need to have systemic diversity, so that the well-being of all peoples is respected, nurtured, and cultivated in order to truly move towards a culture of peace. I think that's what I would say in a nutshell when referring to the wisdom from indigenous cultures about fostering a culture of peace.
Thank you. Much of your research addresses diversity challenges faced by organizations in the private sector. Often businesses are presented as an unlikely ally for peaceful relations, and more frequently than not, they're positioned as a contributor to conflict and violence. What opportunities do they present in advancing peaceful relations?
Thanks for that question. It's truly a wonderful one because when we look at multinational organizations, when we look at corporations around the world, they do have so much of clout. Whether it is building arms, selling arms, the arms race, whether it is selling organs, whether it is selling products like food, ships, computers, they can contribute to conflict and violence, but they can, on the other hand, and we hope that that's the way we go, and I hope that the research that I do contributes to creating and advancing peaceful relations. Yet, much of management thinking today is based in many ways on neoliberalism, which gears economies, businesses, and whole societies towards constant material growth and achievement of financial wealth. I mean, look at the waste that takes place in countries, which many people could live on for a year or more. This managerialist capitalist ideology reinforces existing dominant structures that have long suppressed the voices and values of indigenous peoples and Eastern epistemologies. Don't get me wrong, I'm not romanticizing indigenous peoples or Eastern epistemologies. Every country, every person has their positives and negatives. But I do strongly believe that indigenous peoples and Eastern epistemologies have much to teach the world and much to facilitate the world and individuals towards a culture of peace. If we focus, for example, on indigenous wisdom and perspectives from it, a culture of peace can be built through orienting businesses and other institutions, including and in particular educational institutions and business organizations, towards fostering relationships, reciprocity, responsibility, and redistribution for shared well being, which leads to a culture of peace, as also emphasized in the 8 pillars of positive peace. It is an opportunity to shift thinking and invoke indigenous wisdom for management learning and creating a culture more aligned to peace. Such a culture emphasizes knowledge, values, and worldviews, which are part of the sacred ecology and relationships with the ecosystem, or eco spirituality, which is affirming, healing, challenging, integrating, and renewing mindsets through education and management learning and perspectives. In fact, this stance encourages the well being and flourishing of a new economics to inform management thinking and learning. This perspective moves away from humans as dominant over nature. Rather, it stresses a more life affirming and life enhancing approach that is connected and relational. After all, Mother Earth feeds us, nurtures us, provides us with rain, provides us with everything that we need. If only we remember to treat her with respect, with dignity, and put back into her what we keep extracting. Hence, in creating a culture of peace, I pivot towards wisdom, which is holistic, to give voice to many more peoples and engage in collaborative efforts. Or, as a wise elder stated about what shamans in his village told him, and this is a note to organizations, sometimes you have to stop so your soul can catch up with you. And I'd like to end my response to this question by quoting from the Sufi mystic Jalaluddin Rumi, who wrote, "Sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment."
Thank you. I was intrigued to read a paper of yours where you analysed ancient Indian stone inscriptions for management, diversity management in the workplace. What can we learn from cultural artifacts, ancient or new, when working towards a culture of peace?
All of us are products of our history, whether we like it or not. So, whether we were once part of an empire as victors, as colonizers, or as colonized peoples, it impacts how we are today and many of the decisions that we take. I'm going to move quite far back in history to the 3rd century BC Emperor Ashoka, who based his governance on Dhamma or Dharma, which is right duty, and who showed how an Eastern legacy can enable peace. I want to therefore reconstruct for present contemporary organizations their thinking and their perspectives through focusing on a culture of peace by looking at the intersections of history, politics, gender, and diversity. Many of us have heard of the Rosetta Stone, the ancient papyrus manuscripts, but perhaps few of us have heard of the Ashokan stelae or inscriptions, which do present a novel database from which to analyze and garner insights for creating a culture of peace and for management learning. The word itself, Ashoka, when translated, means away from sorrow. And he adopted a state ethic of pluralism and tolerance, something we sorely need today. When we look at what's happening in the US, when we look at what's happening in France, in other parts of the world, including in our own countries, peace is so critical. And the importance of peace being fostered on an unending basis because it never stops. The Emperor Ashoka's inscriptions, 115 edicts and inscriptions, are in caves, rocks, and massive polished pillars, which form symbols of history, hope, and inclusion. He positioned them in various parts of his vast constituency, which consisted of over 500,000 square kilometers and included much of modern day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan. In this article, we argue that by returning to the past, managers can enhance their learning and become more critically reflexive, and this can lead to better practices concerning diversity management and peace. In fact, Ashokan edicts can be viewed as peace rocks for a culture of peace that does in fact rock. He believed in ahimsa or non-violence and implemented this policy towards all people, renunciation of war as an instrument of state policy, and thus peace rather than aggression and force. Other aspects of his reign included compassion, respect, a network of roles with links to regional countries schools and monasteries, enhance trade and welfare for all. So, welfare or the dole given only when one needed it, but not as a general lifestyle. Overall, his teachings enlighten us on how to peacefully and prosperously coexist in diverse, complex societies and organizations where we need to transcend short term needs so that areas that are sacred and non negotiable are honored, to create frameworks for action and soft whispers which linger in hearts and in our minds. So that's what the Emperor Ashoka did. And that is a true effort, if you will, and a celebration of values that foster peace.
Based on what you've said so far, do you think fostering a culture of peace should be a local or an international initiative?
I am all for collaboration. So I think it must be a collaborative effort. If you think of the three pieces that I mentioned, and the three pieces are ones which have been published in 2020. Of course, I have written a lot over many years, and the three pieces focus on indigenous peoples worldwide. They focus on organizations around the world, but they also emphasize the need for women to be people who are respected. They focus on the need for indigenous people to share their knowledge and to ensure that their knowledge, their wisdom is respected, is legitimized by other people, not only by themselves. I think fostering a culture of peace has to be a braiding. We live in a woven universe, and therefore it must be a collaborative effort. We are all entangled with each other, whether we like it or not. Of course, COVID is an example of that. But if you think of other aspects, whether it be faith, and I'm talking here about world affirming faith, whether it be forms of mindfulness, meditation, prayer, whether it be sharing of developmental initiatives, whether it be loans or whether it be products and processes and searches for various vaccines, I think it has to be a collaborative effort because all of us are part of a gestalt. So we must join the dots. And that's really something we have to learn to depend upon each other. And when people depend on us, whether it is nationally, locally, or internationally, that we honor that dependence by making each other, uh, honoring each other, by making each other lift themselves up and be interdependent. So we all collaborate and we all put back into the basket of knowledge for the privilege of living on this earth.
And finally, stemming from that, what advice would you give to those who try to encourage cultures of peace wherever they live?
Just a few words on that. Again, each of these questions, I could spend days talking about them. But some, I hope, pearls of advice, if you will, be compassionate disruptors. So disrupt compassionately. Dialogue, action, measurement, humor, world affirming faith with prayer and grit. I'm not a believer of aggression. I think being compassionate, being world affirming might take time, but in the long run, it's much more useful, it stays longer, and it gets embedded into people's mindsets and their consciousness. So we must remember, when we receive, we must give back. I mentioned reciprocity earlier. There has to be redistribution. It has to be relational. And we have to remember that we are all in this together. Therefore, we put back into the basket of knowledge, of life, for the privilege of living on this fragile planet. And I do hope, as a final word, that it may be said of each of us that we give back much in return. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edwina. What an affirmation to keep searching for a culture of peace in a variety of places, with bewilderment and compassion and a respect for our entanglements with people and planet. It was great to have you at Rising 2020 and to hear your words. It's a shame there's not a room full of people with questions, because I'm sure you would have had lots. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And kia ora, Maoriora, tihei, Maoriora. Thank you.
Thank you.